Hey, hello Internet. In this video I want to touch in a very basic subject, which is setting keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop, custom shortcuts to use for artists. And why would I do such video? Let me show you my setup. Okay, so that's my setup. Here I have my screen where I use my digital pen, and here I keep my keyboard. So basically I use the keyboard with one hand, and the hand rests most of the time over this area, close to the Control, Alt, Space and Shift keys. Ideally I would be able to easily reach the most used keyboard shortcuts from here. But as I'm sure you know, in Photoshop, the keyboard shortcuts are spread around the keyboard, and not thinking about really using the keyboard with one hand but with two. Why is that a problem? Well, for instance, 3 or 4 of my most used keyboard shortcuts are for the brush tool, which is set to the B key as default, the eraser tool, which is set to the E key as default, then the lasso tool, which is in the L as default, and then Control Z to do a step backward. Yeah, so if let's say I have to use these keyboard shortcuts 10 times per minute, imagine that my hand must move between these keys all around the keyboard constantly. And this is not very comfortable. I mean, it would be much better if all the keys were set to these 3 keys, for instance. So I would have Control C, brush, eraser and lasso. And this is actually my current setup. Okay, but you may have one objection, which is, I already know lots of keyboard shortcuts for Photoshop. Why should I change them now? I mean, if I didn't know them, then okay, but I know them already. So I would change it, then I would need to relearn all of them, and that would be a pain. To that, my answer, first of all, is it's much easier than you think to relearn shortcuts. And the reason for that is that you're going to be using them all the time. So the ones that you use very often, you will learn very quickly anyway. After I changed my shortcuts, I learned in like 2 hours I was already totally used, because I'm using some of the shortcuts all the time, literally every 10 seconds, lots of times. It's much more easy to learn than what you may think. The other reason, or the other argument, is that you don't need to change all the shortcuts. Some of them are fine. For example, Control Z is very easy to reach. If you keep your hand around the bottom of your keyboard, you don't need to change all of them. The other reason is, well, you can keep most of the shortcuts already as a default if you want. I reassigned all of them. I went a bit crazy with that. But you could, I don't know, you could pick the 4, 5 or 6 tools that you use more often and reassign them and end up at that. So that would be fine. So I'm going to explain to you what I did to reassign the keyboard shortcuts for Photoshop, because this is a quite engaging process. So first of all, the first thing that you need to know is what tools and what menu applications and what panel application shortcuts you are going to reassign. You need to know which ones you are using most frequently, and this is something that you should just know from your head if you're using Photoshop quite a lot. I mean, there is no secret for that. What I did just was open a spreadsheet. Either you go to Google Drive or you use Excel, the program. No, I don't want to take a tour. And you can create a new spreadsheet, call it however you like, uh, custom keyboard shortcuts, my custom keyboard shortcuts for Photoshop, for example. And then what I did was listing the tools and functions that I use most often from the top of my head. Um, and just write them down. For instance, brush, eraser, uh, step back, lasso, free transform tool, um, marquee tool, default foregrounds, background color, swap foreground background color, flip flip image or horizontally, and so on. Just fill it in, whatever comes to your head that you know that you use them. If you are not sure and you don't remember, you could just, the next time you need to do something with Photoshop, just write down the shortcuts that you use, or you could just, I don't know, you could just Google commonly used keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop or something like that. Anyway, once you have your list, which doesn't need to be too long, what I did was order the list by frequency of usage. How did I do it? Very simple. Just in a new column, just name it frequency or something like that, and assign a number to each item. What I did was assign from 1 to 5, where 1 was least often used and 5 was most often used. In this case, for instance, brush would be 5, eraser would be also 5, step back 5, lasso, for the sake of example, 4, free transform for tool 4, marquee maybe 2, default foreground background color maybe 3, 3 and 4, whatever. And now you order them. And to do that, it's very simple. Just select both columns, right click, and go to sort range. At least in the case of Google spreadsheets, and then you sort by the column which has the frequency on it. In this case, the column B, and sort. And now you would have sorted the tools and functions by order of usage. So I already did it, of course, and I ended up with there you go. I ended up like that. You can see there's lots of things, but I got the tools and functions that I use the most. Brush, lasso, increase brush size, decrease brush size, switch foreground background colors, save new layer group, delete layer, and so on and so on and so on, from most used to least used. Once having done that, the next step would be to create something that I call heat map for your keyboard, which would look something like that. This picture is done for illustrating purposes. You don't need to create that, but what you need to do is where your hand or your fingers rest most of the time, and what keys are more accessible, more easy to reach from where your hand is. I did this picture to show it. I painted in purple the modifier keys, Shift, Control, Alt, Spacebar, Shift. Those are fixed. You cannot change or modify them, and they have a special role in Photoshop. So naturally your hand should be close to the modifier keys. Then, as my hand is resting in the bottom left corner of the keyboard, I painted in red the keys ASDF and ZXCB, and those are the most easy to reach. Then, in order of easiness to reach, is orange, where I need to extend my fingers a bit or move my hand slightly. Yellow, green, and blue. The blue keys are basically keys that I almost never use, and if I use them, it's just the single key, like just press U or J or M, never with modifier keys. Like I don't have anything assigned to Control K, for instance, because it's too far. It's just too hard to press those keys. And as you can see, I have some orange and yellow keys in the right side, and the reason for that is because in the later stages of creating an illustration, I use lots of adjustments, like adjustment layers. For example, curves adjustment layers, or hue and saturation, color balance, and so on. And when I'm applying those layers, I don't use the brush or the eraser or most of the tools and functions that I use while I'm painting. So I just move my hand over this area here, and I assign these keys to creating adjustment layers. Um, so you decide something like this. As I said, you don't need to make this picture. You just know where you will have your hand more or less. If you use your pen with your right hand, um, it's probably more likely that you will have a setup similar as the one I have, but it may be different, and it depends if you use a digital tablet or a graphics tactile tablet, or whatever you use. So that's up to you. It may change in your case, but you need to decide that. You need to decide that. Yes, that's correct. My English is so good. Gosh. Then the step 3, you have to basically which tools and functions you need to use more often, and you know what keys are most easy to reach. So you just assign the one to the other. And how you would do it would be in a new spreadsheet. Yeah, you could say, well, why don't I go to Photoshop and begin assigning the keys in any way that I like? Well, I will tell you later. But first, I will show you what I did. So in the first column, I wrote down the keys of the keyboard, like Z, X, C, V, which would be the bottom row, then B, N, B, N, M, and so on. Let me just copy that very quickly. So you would get something like that. This one would be the first row, the bottom row. This one would be the second row. This one would be the third row, and those are the function keys on top. Oops, I forgot to leave one row empty here. So in the rows, you add the combinations of modifier keys. Control, you would get something like this. The free key means that you press, for instance, the Z key without any modifier key. Control would mean that you press Control plus Z. Shift Control would mean, in this case, that you press Shift plus Control plus Z, and so on and so on. Now you got your basic table setup, and what you need to do is, based on the list of tools and functions on the frequency usage, you just begin assigning them. For instance, brush tool, you decide to set it up to the Z. Control Z, maybe you need to keep step back because it's just convenient to have it there and it's very frequently used. Then the next tool by usage order will be the eraser tool, which maybe you assign to the X, which is right next to the Z, and it's very convenient. And the C could be, and the lasso tool, maybe you want to assign it to the next free key, and the free transform tool, maybe you assign it to Control X, maybe. And you may be wondering why I'm following this order. First of all, let me tell you why it's convenient to have the keyboard shortcuts first set up in an Excel sheet and not directly into Photoshop. And the reason is twofold. One, if you begin assigning keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop directly, you may maybe assign one, then change your mind later, and this may be a mess because you don't keep track of what you changed, what you did not change, and it's just easier to assign everything first here. You can switch it as much as you want. You can say, okay, no, maybe free transform tool here is not so good. Let's change it to some other. Let's change it to, I don't know, to B, because it's somehow more convenient for me there. Because I changed my mind, because I find another keyboard shortcut that's better for Control C, Control X. And the second reason why you want to create the spreadsheet is to have a reference sheet which is more easily accessible and more easy to follow and to visualize than the reference material that Photoshop gives by default, which is just a list with all the functions and all the keyboard shortcuts. And it may be more difficult to find what you are looking for. So that's much easier. When you are doing this process, you must keep in mind that, well, first of all, some keyboard shortcuts are not allowed by the operating system. Like, for instance, Alt plus F4 is reserved to close programs, I think, for Windows. I think Control F1 and Control F12 are also reserved for some other functions, and you cannot assign them. Some other functions are reserved by Photoshop also. But the thing is that you don't need to worry much about those, because when you try to assign them, Photoshop will show an error message and will tell you, no, you cannot do it. Just choose something else, and nothing will happen. You will not mess with anything. So that's no problem. Then for the tools like brush, eraser, and so on, you must assign single keys. And what I mean by single keys is you cannot assign Control C, for instance. You cannot assign a key, one of those, with a modifier key. So tools can only be assigned, in this case, in the first row in here, but only to alphabetic characters, alphabetic keys, only to letters. You, for instance, cannot assign tool to this symbol. Photoshop doesn't allow it, apparently. It must be A to Z keys. And also the combination of Shift plus letter key is reserved by Photoshop to cycle between whatever tools are assigned to that key. For instance, let's say that I assign the brush to the Z key, And the pencil tool I also assign to the C key. So that's possible. You can do it. And if then I hold Shift and I press Z, I will cycle between those tools. Then that's it for tools. And for the applications and panel menus, which are the tools you access from the menu bar. The application menus are anything that you can access from here, and the panel menus are like color swatches, the little windows that are part of your interface, that they have also functions. Basically, I use them most for toggle whether they are shown or not. So for the application menus and the panel menus, it's kind of the opposite as for tools. You have to use a combination of modifier keys, that is Control, Shift Control, Alt Control, and so on, and keyboard, like, let's say, quote quote normal keys. But in this case, you can use things that are not letters, and you can even use numbers. For instance, you could use Control 1 and assign it to a nav menu or panel menu function. And you can also use F1 to F12 for that. But no single keys, as I said. You cannot assign the, I don't know, the B key pressed by itself to open a new file, for instance. So that would be the limitations or the constraints that you have to take into account when deciding the shortcuts. Besides that, I would also suggest something that I call best practices. And those would be avoid overly complicated combinations of keys. For instance, I tend to avoid combinations of a key with Alt Shift Control, because it's just like you have to press 4 keys at the same time, and it's like if I can spare me that, I would do. Then if you are really very used to a shortcut, maybe it would be a good idea to leave it as is. The most obvious example would be Control Z for step back. If this is your case, obviously feel free to do it. All these things should be done. It's very subjective what works for you and should be done with common sense. And this leads me to my last best practice, which would be that use your common sense. Uh, for instance, let's say that you got as priority something like that. You got this priority. It may make no sense, but for the sake of illustration, you got that save has high priority. Then the next thing that you have is copy, and the next thing you have is save as, but you don't do it so often. So you would then like have save as high priority, then immediately followed by copy something, then save as, and you want to assign them. And let's say that you assign save to control. You should really, I would suggest assigning save as Control S, because it's so, I mean, what else could that be? But for the sake of example, maybe you assign save to Control V, and then you want to be super strict and you say, okay, the next thing in priority is copy. So I assign copy to Control Shift V. And then let me add let me add paste also here, paste, which comes later in priority. So the next thing is paste. You assign paste because it's the next empty shortcut to Alt Control V. So you have save to Control V, copy to Shift Control V, and paste to Alt Control V. And then the next one is save, and you assign save as to the next available key, which is close, which is Control A. So you have Control V for save and Control A for save as. And that's crazy, right? That makes no sense at all. So you shouldn't do something like that. You shouldn't be like super strict on the way in which you assign the shortcuts. Use your common sense. I mean, this is a very obvious example that you should not do. What you should do in this case is, if you really wanted to keep save in Control V, you would then put save as in Shift Control V, and maybe copy and paste would go to Control A. Control A would be copy and paste would be Shift Control A. Would still be pretty crazy. In my setup, if you want to know, I have save in Control S and save as in Shift Control S. I mean, that's like the default. And copy in Control C and paste in Control V, like the default, of course. I mean, this is a very obvious example. I keep them as a default, although I change many others, but I keep those as a default. Copy, paste, save as, because they are fine as they are. And copy is Control C and paste is Control V for have been there forever. It's kind of silly to change them. Let me show you a more simple example. So, for instance, flip horizontally and flip vertically. I do flip horizontally much more often than flip vertically. So in principle, it's much more high in priority. So one could say that maybe I have this, I don't remember. I have flip horizontally in Control Shift A, actually, and flip vertically comes much lower in priority. So I don't know, maybe I ended up setting that in Control Q. But since those two things are so similar, I decided to put this here in Alt Control A. I think it's there. It may be in Alt Control Shift anyway, because they are very similar. They share the same key, A. You should do things like that. So this is my assigned keys actually. Okay, so you should end up with something like this. In the end, you may have much less assignments. I got a bit crazy with that. So once you have something like that, which I mean, you could skip this, but I highly recommend it. It's up to you. Once you have this decided, you just go into Photoshop and you assign the keys like you go to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, and here you could select either application menu or panel menu or tool, and assign each key. For instance, if I go and to assign this key, just go to any whatever tool or function that you want to assign. Click on top and just press the key. And as I mentioned, for instance, for tools, you cannot assign modifier keys plus other keys. So for instance, if I try to assign here control U, for instance, or whatever, it tells me it's not valid. If I wanted to assign, for instance, let's go to application menus and let's pick whatever. If I wanted to assign Alt F4 to this, Alt F4 cannot be assigned because it is used by the operating system. So it gives you an error and you just cannot assign. You see? Okay, while you are assigning that, what you should do is, if you assign something, if you assign something in the tools, it will not happen, but if you go to the application menus, let's say that I want to, you see that I have open assigned to Control O, which is a default, by the way. If I wanted to assign Control O to something else that I established that I want in my custom shortcuts, like whatever thing, literally place embedded, which I don't know what it is, but I wanted to assign it to Control O. I press Control O and it tells me it's already in use and will be removed from whatever is assigned now. So I would click on just accept, and accepting would remove this shortcut from the other thing and apply it to this function, and just click accept because you already decided that you want these shortcuts, right? So shouldn't be a problem. So once you set up all your custom shortcuts, you have to save them because you don't want to lose them. So go here underneath the set, and you could click on the first button to save them. It's grayed out in my case because I didn't do any change with respect to what I have saved already. But if I did one change, for instance this, I would see here a message which has been modified, and then I would be able to save them. I'm going to undo this, and that's it. And I'm not going to save them, obviously. Last step would be to get used to your shortcuts. This is much easier than it may look like. I have really nothing special to say here. Just open Photoshop, set it to work, begin working in some artwork, and hopefully you will get used to that in half an hour, in 1 hour, and hopefully you feel that it's much easier and much faster to work like that. Finally, I will leave a link to my keyword shortcuts file and to this Excel sheet in the description. And if you download my keyboard shortcut file, you can load it into Photoshop. But to do that in Windows, you have to go to your hard disk, then your users, your username, whatever it is. Then you have to go to App Data, Roaming, Adobe, whatever version of Adobe you have, Presets, Keyboard Shortcuts, and here you would paste the file that you downloaded, and in Photoshop you would go to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, and you should be able to see it here. Then you click on it and you load it. Alright, so that's all for this video. I hope it was useful or more or less clear. It may seem a bit daunting. I mean, I get a bit crazy with being very thorough sometimes with the things I do. But if you want, you can take it easier. Just assign 10 or 5 shortcuts, or even 3. I mean, I use the brush, eraser, and lasso tool a lot. So you could just go ahead and assign them to the Z, X, and C keywords, keys, whatever is useful to you. Go ahead, try it. Leave a comment and like this video if you like, and see you next time.